to spend the rest of our time together this morning talking about some observable steps of spiritual interest that people generally pass through on their path to saving faith in Jesus, and that's why we want to turn to John chapter 7. Again, we're talking now this morning about having spiritual conversations with people before they come to church. Obviously, the goal is for them to come to saving faith and to get involved in church. That hasn't gone away. The church isn't going away. It's just the path that they come to it is changing a little bit. And so there's going to be a lot more conversations with people before they get here. And that's why I wanted to take just a few minutes this morning and highlight some of the steps that people make on their path of progress to being completely shut down to coming to saving faith that are observable so that we might be able to recognize them and lean into them a little bit. It's kind of an exciting thing to think about. We can best observe this path of progress towards saving faith in the account of the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. It is a decent portion of text, but it's worth going ahead and reading through that portion. It's only about 20 verses or 21 verses, but I'm going to go ahead and read them all through so we can go back and illustrate these paths of progress. So follow along with me. I'm going to begin in verse 7 of John chapter 4, where it says, "There came a woman of Samaria to draw water, and Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink.' For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?' For Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself, and his sons, and his cattle?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst, but the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty nor come all the way here to draw." He said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman said to him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have correctly said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he." At this point his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why do you speak with her?" So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, "Come and see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" Now, I'm going to stop there. What we have in this account out of the gate is a Samaritan woman who began this encounter with Jesus antagonistic towards him. Do you follow me? She began the account with him in a state of antagonism towards him. And we see this antagonism most prominently in verse 9. Follow along with me where I'll read it again. "Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?' For Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." The author is making sure that we know there was problems there. There was hostility there. However, despite the antagonism and hostility that it began with, this encounter ended in saving faith. And we see this at the very end of the passage in verses 28 and 29, where it says, "So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, 'Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?'" So as we look closer, we can see that there are actually incremental steps, 3 of them in particular, in this path of progress of the Samaritan woman, where she went from antagonism to saving faith. Again, she started antagonistic, she ended in saving faith, and there's actually some paths of progress that we can observe where she went into a warmer and warmer place until she got from complete antagonism to full-out belief. It's very interesting to see it. The first is that the first step of progress was that she moved from hostility towards Jesus to being intrigued by him. She moved from hostility to intrigue, okay? And by intrigue, I mean curious, interested, that kind of thing, okay? When Jesus spoke to her of living water, I'm going to give you one more second so those who want to write down can write down, so I don't fly past this stuff. But this will be up on the web for you to be able to jot down later if you missed something. When Jesus spoke to her of living water, she replied in verse 11 and 12 with this, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?" And what I want you to see here is that at this point in the dialogue, at this point in the conversation, this Samaritan woman didn't really take Jesus that seriously. You can almost feel the sarcasm coming off the page as she's speaking to him. But she was intrigued enough by what he was saying to remain in the conversation. All right, there was sarcasm there. Like, what are you talking about? But at the same time, she was intrigued by him, and she was intrigued enough to remain in the conversation. And that may not feel like a lot. She's speaking to him sarcastically. That may not feel like a lot, but it's actually a significant step of progress. The Samaritan woman's shift from being hostile to being intrigued is what enabled her to communicate with Jesus. It enabled her to communicate with him. All right? And this laid the foundation for all of the wonderful things that followed. There was hostility, and this shift away from hostility to intrigue at least laid the foundation for some communication, some dialogue, some talking in a non-threatening way. This is the first step of spiritual progress. When people can become just a little bit more open to Jesus and a little less hostile than they were initially, this opens up the lines of communication. And I try to keep that in mind as I'm talking to people. Instead of trying to get them to drop to their knees and to repent and receive Jesus right then and there, I ask myself the question as I'm talking to them, what can I say? How can I have this conversation with them in a way that would leave them just a little bit more open to Jesus than they were before? And what things can I avoid that would cause them to shut down and to either remain hostile or become more hostile than they were before? Sometimes we can take the truth and we can put it at them in such a way that shuts them down further. But what can I say? How can I present things? How can I do things in a way that will cause them to be just a little bit more open than they were before? That's what we're aiming for here. That's what Jesus did here. Now she was able to have a conversation with him. Now this is a long way from saving faith, by the way. But this is a step in the progression that can't be skipped at all. A relationship must be formed in order to impart truth. I think we all understand that here. And this is exactly what was happening with the Samaritan woman. He was establishing a constructive dialogue to build upon. In the same way, the reason I'm sharing this with you is in the same way, the world is filled with people just like the Samaritan woman was, that are hostile towards Jesus and his followers, who are us today. And this world can view Christians in a variety of negative ways. They can view us as hypocrites. Have you ever been called a hypocrite before? You ever heard Christians described as hypocrites all the time? They can call us hypocrites. They can call us superstitious, rejectors of science. They can call us promoters of hatred and injustice. They have all kinds of things that they label us with, and stereotypes that they place on us. And if I might be bold and just a little bit real here, we haven't always been helpful. We've done plenty of things to confirm these negative stereotypes to people, and it's just such a shame. That's the opposite of what we need to do. We need to be very careful, and we need to disarm that. We need to watch what we say and what we do. But regardless of the reason that people may be antagonistic, we make progress at this point by first opening up the lines of communication. We must disarm their hostility and leave them just a little bit more open to Jesus, and a little bit more open to a conversation about him than before. How do we do this? We do it by following Jesus' example in the text. And simply put, Jesus didn't fit her negative stereotypes. She had all kinds of negative stereotypes about Jews, all right? Jesus didn't fit them. The Samaritan woman was hostile to the Jews, but she became intrigued by Jesus. Why? Because he was a Jew, but he didn't speak and act like all the other Jews that she'd encountered before. She's encountered Jews before, and they've been rude to her and nasty to her. This is not the way she was used to being treated by someone who was a Jew. The only Jews that she ever knew were self-righteous and condescending and hypocritical. And so she just assumed that Jesus would be that same way. But he reached out to her with genuine love and respect, while at the same time owning his Jewish heritage. And by the way, as she was snarky to him as well. She was snarky and sarcastic in the beginning, and he replied with kindness and patience. And the whole time that he's treating her this way, that's very different from any Jew that she's ever met before, he was fully acknowledging the fact that he was a Jew. He wasn't hiding who he was at all. He was acknowledging who he was, but treating her in a completely different way. This fascinated her. She was intrigued. She marveled at it. And it caused her to be less hostile and more open to the conversation. Jesus didn't fit her negative stereotype. Does that make sense? That's what's going on here. And in the same way today, we must be aware of this world's prejudices against Christ and his church, and we must not fit them. We must be different. But we must be different without disconnecting ourselves. You know, sometimes people say, I'm not like Christians. I'm not, they distance themselves with Christianity and say, I'm not like them because I want nothing to do with them. That's not the way this works. That isn't what Jesus did here. We are different by distancing ourselves from any negative stereotype or a negative behavior, but at the same time, we fully acknowledge who we are and what we stand for at the same time. I am a Christian, but I am doing my best to live humbly before my God and follow him and emulate him. And I acknowledge any mistakes that I make when I make them, but at the same time, I'm trying real hard here, and I am a Christian, and I'm not ashamed of that. In other words, we must be Christians who live the truth that we preach, okay? And this disarms people when people really encounter that, when they encounter someone who is fully Christian and who acknowledges it to their core of their being, but they don't fit the negative stereotypes that they've had before. And we can probably all think of examples of times that we've had that happen, but I can remember, I've witnessed over the years a lot, there have been times where people expected somebody very hypocritical who would be very judgmental of their practice and their behavior. That's probably the thing that we come across the most, is someone who expects us to really criticize what they're doing, and we don't. And it's not that we're approving of it, but we don't really concern ourselves with that. We just love on them and care about them and show that we respect them and we're kind to them. While at the same time, standing with Jesus, it's intriguing to them. It's not what they're used to. It causes them to lean in. Sometimes people will think that we're mindless and we're superstitious. I can remember back when I was in the National Guard, this was years and years ago now, there were a lot of college students that would come into the National Guard for the free college money back then. And so there were a lot of people that were getting their minds filled with all kinds of scientific things, and sometimes it would kind of cause them to be a little high and mighty about what they thought they knew, and they would be very antagonistic towards Christians, and they would see them as superstitious. And I was somebody who was very open about my faith. And they just projected that onto me, but as they would have conversations with me, and as I was able to articulate why I believed what I believed, it was disarming to them. That isn't to say that I would explain to people why I believe what I believe and they would fall on their knees and they would repent and they would get saved right there. That isn't what happened. It never happened to me that way. But they would be intrigued and they would lean in, and they would be a little bit more open to Christianity and to Christ than they were before. And it really laid the groundwork for saving faith to happen in their lives later on down the line. There are some of these people that I witnessed to in the National Guard that seem to want nothing to do with it, that are now Christians. One in particular is a Christian who is part of an Alliance church where my family goes now. I actually was shocked to find him there. I couldn't believe it. And this is like 10, 12, 15 years later. It takes time. But if we can interact with these people in a way that causes them to be just a little bit less hostile and more intrigued, it's a step. It's a step forward. All right? Does that make sense? All right. Now, I wanted to mention as well, I apologize, before we moved on, that there's a lot more we could say about why the Jews and the Samaritans had hostility, antagonism towards each other. There's way more that we could go into on that, and we're not going to do that this morning. But I am going to publish a supplemental on that, and I'm going to put that up on the website in the spot that I described to you earlier. And it's already in the archive portion, but it's going to go up live probably Monday or Tuesday. But it goes into the specifics of why it was that the Jews and the Samaritans were so hostile. Now, for those of you who were here last week, you remember I touched on the Samaritans and where they came from and why they were there. But this other supplemental, which is a little bit near 10 minutes long, actually goes into why there was hostility there in detail and explains a lot of the things. And so I recommend that you check that out if you're interested, okay? But hostility to intrigue is the first step. The progression doesn't stop here. Next, she moved from intrigue to respect. She was intrigued, and she moved from intrigue to respect. And it was genuine, and it came when Jesus gave some insight into her personal life. If you remember, there was a part where he said, "Go call your husband," and she said, "Well, I have no husband." He says, "Well, you've had 5, and the one you're with now isn't your husband at all." So you said correctly. There was some probing insight there that happened. And she responded in verse 19 by saying, "Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet." Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. The Samaritan woman still had not come to saving faith yet. But at this point, her conversation with Jesus was no longer snarky. It was a lot more serious. She was genuinely asking questions. She was genuinely receiving from him. It had moved beyond sarcasm. At this point, she was placing some real value on what he was saying. She was taking him very seriously, and she was carefully considering the words that he was saying. And this is seen in the substantive spiritual question that she asked him in the next verse. We see it in verse 20, where it says, "Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." In other words, which mountain is the right one to worship God on? That's basically what she's saying. Again, if you're not sure why they're asking, what mountain am I supposed to worship on? Watch the supplemental. I go into the details there, okay? But the point here is that the Samaritan woman's shift from being merely intrigued to being genuinely respectful enabled her to learn from him, all right? As she shifted from intrigued to respectful, she started asking him spiritual questions with the desire to hear what he had to say and to take it seriously. It enabled her to learn from him, and that's powerful. It doesn't necessarily mean saving faith yet, but now she's taking what he has to say seriously, and she's learning from him. It encouraged her to ask the hard questions, and it enabled her to receive the answers that Jesus gave. And again, this is the next step of progress in saving faith. After becoming a little bit more open to Jesus in hearing what he has to say, there can be the development of a genuine respect for Jesus. Even if it isn't saving faith yet, there's at least a genuine respect there that enables people to take his word seriously. And when they hit this point, you can say things like, the word says this, the Bible says this. And even though they don't sit there and say, oh, the Bible is the authoritative word of God, there's something in them that causes them to take it seriously and to think about it and puts weight behind it. This is a very powerful step forward that people make before they become saved. And it's something, when you start seeing this, be encouraged. Even though they haven't fallen to their knees yet, and even though they're not praying the sinner's prayer, that means they're heading in the right direction. It's a really good sign. This is a crucial step in the process. It can't be skipped. God's truth cannot be received without respect for both the message and the messenger. And by the way, respect is something that we earn, right? It's not something we can just walk up to people we don't know and expect them to have for us. And I think that's a mistake we've made as Christians. I don't know if you've made it. I know I've made it, and I have seen that sometimes encouraged in the church, but this idea that we can just march up to somebody that we don't know and corner them and give them all these facts and details about the Bible and expect them to fall and repent right then and there and respond without having some credibility with them, without developing a relationship and building some rapport and respect with them, that's not the way it works. We've done damage when we've tried to do it that way. And sometimes because we're not getting the results that we want, we can even resort to things like manipulation and coercion and fear, trying to get them to respond the way we want them to respond, when in fact none of that is the right way. The reality is that we need to cultivate a relationship and then cultivate respect. And how do we cultivate respect? I would suggest to you that we earn it by living out our faith in front of them day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. We earn it by practicing what we preach for the long run, for the long haul. It is a lifelong process. It is accomplished by planting our feet down somewhere and sticking it out with the people that God calls us to reach, even when there are days, and there will always be days, where those people look like they're never going to get it. We stay there and we love on them anyway because God called us to be there. And as we do that over time, the walls get broke down and respect is earned, and we earn the credibility to speak into their lives. That is how this works. It is not a glamorous and showy thing. This is not accomplished by trying to get huge amounts of people in a room and getting them to all march to the altar all at once. This is done by living your life faithfully with the few people that God has placed into your life. And it's something that we're all working on. I talk a lot about it here now, my journey on this, just because it's such an integral part of my life. But I know that my experiences are no different than the experiences you're having. My outside in the world experiences happen to be at a grocery store right now. And I can tell you that even recently, it happens different ways, but right now, there is an Instacart shopper that comes in there. That I have known for 2 years. He's been kind of a difficult person. He hasn't been an easy person to get along with, believe it or not. But I've known him for 2 years, and he comes in there all the time. And over the past month or so, something happened in his life. He started waking up, and he started becoming a lot more spiritually aware, and you'll never guess what's happening. He comes up to me now every time I see him, and he's asking me spiritual questions. I'm wanting to talk about. He's asking me for advice about. Last time I spoke to him, he asked me about advice about what kind of music he should be listening to and what kind of music he should be getting rid of. Things like that. Trying to get. He's come to me because he respects me and he cares about what I have to say, and I earn that respect by just living and working with this guy for years. And it wasn't always easy. We haven't always gotten along. But because we both stayed in it, there's respect that was formed there. And it's exciting. You guys all have your places where you have your feet planted down, and you're doing the same thing. I'm not trying to single out one above another, but I think of Alan and Heather just because it sinks in right now. I really enjoy watching this. You guys all know that I think they go to Tim Hortons on Six Corners every day, right? I think is it 7 days a week, or it's got to be close. But they're there so much that there's that the entire environment knows them and expects them, and there has been they have been recognized by that place as an asset and someone who adds value, and that is how I believe they have brought someone to this church through that relationship or that commitment. And my point here is that's how it works. It's not a flashy thing. There have been plenty of days that they've sat down there and they've had coffee and talked to no one. They've had plenty of days where they've talked to people and they've probably been snubbed off, but they keep going day after day, and they are not fitting the negative stereotypes, and they are open about their faith at the same time, and they're earning respect, and they're earning the ability to speak into people's lives. That's how it works. They're doing it. I know you guys are doing it. And the reason that I'm showing you all this stuff on the board is just to give you tools that we're working on here to help you to do that even more than you're already doing, okay? We got to earn respect. But lastly, there was one more step that this woman made. She moved from being respectful to full-blown in belief as the Messiah. Eventually, that respect and that receiving of Jesus' teaching gave way to saving faith. And we see this as she identified him as the Messiah in verses 25 and 26. It says that the woman said to him, "I know the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." And because of the foundation of communication and respect that had already been developed, she was able to receive this truth into her heart. He was able to really put it out there, and she was able to receive it. And it gave way to the transition to saving faith. Again, you can't walk up to somebody you don't know and say Jesus is the Messiah and expect them to respond to it. Well, the word doesn't come back void. No, it doesn't. I'm not saying don't preach. If your expectation is that you're going to walk up to random people and tell them to fall on their face and receive Jesus and have that happen, you're missing it. It doesn't work that way. It's cultivated relationally, and you earn the right to speak that kind of truth into people's lives. And you do it through service. This transition to full belief is what enabled the Samaritan woman to begin following Jesus in her daily life. And what did she do when she began following him? We see it in verses 28 and 29. Oh, sorry. Follow is supposed to be up there. We see, though, I'm going to give you a second to write that down. The respectful to believing enabled following. Once faith came, following came as well. We see following, though, in verses 28 and 29, where it says that she began to preach, or she began to share the word at least, So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, "Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" Do you see what she's doing there? She's actually spreading the word now. She's a believer. She has become one who is preaching. It's really a neat thing to see. It's one of my favorite accounts in the Gospel of John. There's a lot of good ones there. But my point here this morning hopefully is an encouragement that we can experience this today. The church can experience this today. The church is in no danger. There are a lot of people out there wanting us to believe that the church is in danger. It's not. The church ain't going anywhere. Jesus already promised that the gates of hell will never prevail against it. There's nothing happening to this church. It is in no danger. It is changing, though, and that's nothing new. It's done that all along. Throughout the course of its 2,000 years of existence. And if we want to experience the abundant harvest that is right outside the doors and has been there all along, it's not going anywhere, sometimes we just need to make a few adaptations. And sometimes these adaptations are to embrace principles that have been there all along. And in this case, we just need to take it to them where they are. And we need to cultivate some relationships and some communication and earn the right to speak into their life and use the advantages that we have. And if you think about it, that's exactly what Jesus did in John chapter 4 when he went to Samaria in the first place. Samaria is not a place where the average Jew went. They did not pass through there. They went around it. They so despised the Samaritans for reasons that I describe in the supplemental that they didn't even go through there. And so Jesus even going into that place was significant, let alone talking to this woman. And that's why there was such shock over it. But he went there and took the word to them and laid the foundation for saving faith in that city that started there and came into fruition in Acts chapter 8 through Philip the evangelist. It's a wonderful, wonderful account. And again, share your faith, preach Jesus wherever you go, but don't be frustrated if they're not falling to their knees and receiving Christ then and there. And do not resort to manipulation. Do not sow fear into their hearts. Don't tell them that they're going to step outside the door and get hit by a car. Don't do that stuff. That doesn't help. People who make decisions based upon fear follow Jesus out of fear, and they don't know the real Jesus. He is strong enough to be able to save them. We are his instruments. Just be that instrument and represent his love and his truth faithfully.